Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. This is Keep It Real number 13. We have all three of us here, Doug, Trevor, myself, Greg. We have a question from a recent tweet that I think, Doug, you're big on Twitter these days. So I think Doug tweeted recently about
real big,
yeah,
huge,
I'm super big
huge,
on Twitter.
Yeah,
super big. A post about running and sprint mechanics in post-op rehab. So the question was, how do you guys like to start and progress running in post-op rehab? The traditional walk, jog, return to run progression doesn't seem to be up to par for field sport athletes. And Doug's tweet was about just that. So you want to just take it from there and we'll go with it?
Yeah, I don't have the original tweet in front of me, but I think it was something to the effect of that, post-op rehab provides a unique opportunity to work on running mechanics. And, a lot of times we utilize drills to reinforce running mechanics. And sometimes those drill progressions can coincide very nicely with a proper rehab progression. So typically with like ACL rehab, we'll see progressions that are commonly taught where it's like, when it's time to run, like that magical, whatever it is, like 3-month time when it's like, okay, like the protocol says you can run now. And a lot of times, it's 3 months and you're assuming that certain benchmarks have been met that we'll talk about, but assuming those benchmarks have been met, it's like, okay, now it's time to run. And it typically starts with like jogging, building some volume, kind of like what I think is a little bit of an antiquated model, especially for speed-based sports, where you start off with like this kind of base of endurance or volume, and then you somehow decide at a future point that like then it's time to sprint. So you get to 3 months, it's like, okay, go on a treadmill at like a 10-minute mile pace, work up to being able to do a mile in a session, and then somehow later on, then you go and sprint. And there's no discussion of mechanics, positions at all. And I know that in some circles of rehab and sports performance, it can be like taboo to talk about there being, better and worse ways to run. And I think at the elite level, it's one thing to talk about like how, top 5 finisher in the final heat of the Olympics in the 100, nitpicking over their mechanics. But a lot of team sport athletes, frankly, in my opinion, and I think you guys would agree, don't run very well. They violate some principles, running principles that like a track and field sprint coach would say, like, these are kind of non-negotiables. And within those principles, there's room for interpretation and stylistic individualized differences. But there's also certain things that they think are very important that, every sprinter or running athlete should be doing. And even if we say that like, okay, sprint drills don't make you quote unquote faster. And there's a lot of controversy over whether like doing drills make people faster. And to me, I don't even care about the answer to that question, because in a rehab scenario, I think that what sprint drills do provide is almost like a specific strength progression for running. So if you look at something like even like an A march, which can be done, once someone's gait normalizes, like you can have them doing an A march through different amplitudes, different, kind of intent and force at foot strike. An A run or an A march reinforces like the vertical posture that you want to have at maximal velocity. It's reinforcing front side mechanics. You're working a little bit on arm action. And then if you progress that to like, let's say like even something as simple as an A skip and then to an A run, within the march, the skip, and the run, you can manipulate amplitude, you can manipulate cadence, you can manipulate the force at foot strike until you get closer and closer to what sprinting actually looks like. So from a rehab standpoint, early on, people can't run anyway. So even if you want to take the approach and say like, look, sprint drills and technique drills have no carryover to actual running, which I don't actually agree with, because I think that if those drills are coached well, and then you're constantly integrating those drills into the whole movement and going back and forth and using the right cues, I think the drills do have a place. But even if you don't believe that drills have a place in terms of making athletes faster or changing running mechanics, early on when people can't run anyway, maybe all they can do is the drill. And like in my experience, you can get people to do an A run quick sooner than you can get somebody to run on a treadmill. Now, with those drills comes, are you doing the right things on the front end of the rehab? Because I wouldn't have somebody do the drills right away, but like, have you restored range of motion? Have you restored, quad strength, hamstring strength? Because for example, if you want to do like an A march, but you haven't restored knee flexion, now when someone does the A march, like the surgically repaired side you might not be able to get, a nice heel recovery and have the heel approach the butt in an A march or an A run because you haven't restored that knee flexion. So it doesn't mean that we would still violate the other parts of rehab where, like, yeah, we want to get range of motion and strength back. And I think that range of motion and strength, regardless of what your mechanical approach is to running, if you haven't restored that, now you're always going to have this weak link in the chain where it's going to be really difficult to achieve good positions, whatever those look like to you, if the joint itself is not capable of getting into certain positions, whether from like a range of motion or a motor control / strength standpoint. So we still want to adhere to the good principles of rehab where we restore the foundational elements. But I think that once, in conjunction with restoring those foundational elements, we can utilize these running drills early on in the rehab process. And I would much rather have an athlete do, like, let's say like an A run with a lot of intent where it looks like sprinting in terms of the cadence, the positions at the knee, hip, and ankle, than having them slog a couple of miles on a treadmill, because that to me has way less carryover to top speed mechanics and the things that we want to see at top speed than doing some of these drills that become closer and closer to what sprinting looks like. So I would almost take the approach, I'd rather have somebody be able to do almost like extensive tempo type things first and then build volume on top of that. But I think that just building volume early on when you haven't done specific strength work, which I think those drills provide a really nice specific strength progression, I'd rather kind of build speed through the drills and then build volume on top of that than just like have somebody run a treadmill with no regard for mechanics, no regard for foot strike, no regard for posture, and then just like down the road hope that we can turn that into sprinting. I think the sprint drills have a better training effect and carry over to sprinting than just really slow running for a lot of volume on a treadmill. I don't know what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think I like what you said before about, it's like that magic 3-month window. Because if you read a lot of like the lower extremity return, or rehab timelines, you'll see it's just like some kind of arbitrary point in time when it's like running progression can start. But what always kind of, irritates me a little bit is that like then it's like 2 or 3 or 4 weeks later that it's like plyometrics can begin. So when we think about like the forces that people need to be able to do when they're running, it has to be elastic, it has to be a minimal ground contact time, all the positions and postures that you referred to, Doug. And it's like, but then once they've, they can run a 5K, then we can have them start doing like box jumps and plyometrics. And it's like that order is just so inappropriate. And like I have a basketball athlete who's coming off of a lower extremity fracture, and he's, I think this is his 10th week, and then he's supposed to start running at week 12. And it's like, we have to do, so this week, based on his timelines, like we're starting to introduce some really low intensity, low amplitude hops, like the Rudiment series that Dan Paff at Altus refers to. I think that's just such a great progression to get people to start being able to have minimal ground contact times and increase their elasticity and make sure that they're not favoring one extremity versus the other by starting with double leg and progressing to single leg. I think one of the things that I always like to do is make sure that people kind of have the breaks before we even start to get to running. So I like to start doing snap downs and things like that to make sure they can control themselves and stop themselves appropriately. Because I think one of the hard things about running is it's not like the getting going, it's the slowing down and the stopping. So I want people to be able to slow down and stop in pretty minimal times before we even start to do any sort of the extensive or intensive running that ends up kind of coming along later. And for myself, I break things down usually with like acceleration versus max velocity or upright type position. So I think what you explained for the upright stuff is great, Doug. And what I do for kind of the acceleration end is like during their initial strength stuff, like we'll do weighted sled pushes, so the velocity of the movement is super, super low, but they're still getting into those more, forward lean acceleration positions and really working on lower extremity strength. Then we'll decrease the weight. We'll start doing sled runs. Then we'll do some band resisted accelerations and things like that before we start getting into like true hard accelerations. And and those type of higher intensity activities. And then even with the acceleration positions, it's like having a soft start versus a hard start is a great way to kind of change, to kind of go through the progression and keep gradually increasing the stress and the intensity of the activity. So we'll do, whether it's usually I don't start with half kneeling. I think half kneeling is a pretty hard position. We'll start just kind of tall, fall forward runs to get people finding good angles of force application as they get in their acceleration. But I think ultimately it's like for the rehab timeline, there's just this kind of flip-flop of the order of activities, and people should be doing a ton of plyometrics, like low intensity plyometrics, like jump rope and things like that, to get elasticity, make sure that their tissues can handle the force of running. Because I think people underestimate how difficult running actually is in terms of like the forces that people need to be able to handle with it. And the best way to kind of get them prepared for that is having a good amount of volume of low intensity plyometrics rather than getting their tissue volume up with just a bunch of, like you said, kind of slogging, pounding the floor, running for miles and miles and miles, especially on a treadmill. Like I never have anybody run on a flat treadmill. We do a lot of the curved treadmill stuff ourselves because it's a great way to, have them be in really good positions and postures and stuff. And your foot strike is a lot more appropriate on a curved treadmill versus on a flat treadmill.
Awesome. Yeah. And I would think that, I think there's just a disconnect between what people are applying, because I think we would agree, though, that it's still more volume before intensity. Like what we're doing for your volume is just not slog running. It's low level plyos, which is a low level intensity thing. So it's a lower intensity thing than you're then probably going for your slogging run at that point if you're just starting it. So it's that we're proponents of doing lower level plyos, lower intensity plyos with some volume before adding in anything higher intensity. Would you agree with that?
100%.
And I think that like early on you do need to build volume, because I think that building volume and doing aerobic type work does help to desensitize the tissues for running. But Trevor brought up the sled, refresh my memory. I mean, I would much rather early on have somebody do forward sled drag, lateral sled drag, backward sled drag, and get their volume that way and do that, assuming that you have the setup to do it for like 20 to 40 minutes in a session, instead of trying to do a volume-based activity with running and develop aerobic capacity with running. Because I think that you're not going to get, if you have quad inhibition as an example, and you start running, the quad inhibition isn't going to go away when you run. If anything, it might get worse because your body perceives a threat and you shut down even more. If you have some quad inhibition, you can cue somebody and put somebody in a position through how you manipulate the exercise with a sled to force the quad to work in a very low intensity. Do that for 20 minutes. And I like sleds because one of the first things we work on early on is trying to normalize gait. Sleds are a great way to normalize gait because you can put somebody in supported positions, add a little bit of overload. So now they're basically just that specific strength for walking, for gait. Yeah. I'd much rather have somebody do that stuff early on, or even if we're going to go after volume, if someone has a lot of inhibition in the quad, getting them on a bike for an extended period is going to target the quad in a way that I think is more impactful from a rehab standpoint than having them run for 20 minutes on a treadmill. So we're not saying don't try to accumulate volume early on in rehab, but okay. I don't think that running again because even for people who are healthy, how much running do we have them do at a 10 minute per mile pace? It's for a field sport athlete, it's maximal velocity sprinting, maybe some tempo stuff, and then depending on if it's a midfielder in lacrosse, let's say maybe they're doing some slower distance type running too, but it doesn't comprise a bulk of our programming, even in quote unquote healthy athletes. So why are we having injured athletes do it? I think that our mindset is how do we prepare people for the highest intensity activity, which is sprinting? What progressions would be used in a healthy or an injured athlete? And typically a lot of slow running is not part of that progression. And so once somebody can hit the right positions for the higher intensity stuff, then we build volume on top of that. I think that sled drags, as an example, is a better complementary activity for that higher intensity running than is just slow running, when people, even at 3 months, they're going to have some inhibition anyway. So we may as well try to put people in successful positions through drills where that inhibition is less likely to manifest itself, support that with strength work, sled work, overloaded gait work, and then turn that into sprinting versus just running slower and then hoping that they get faster and faster through running with an impaired gait.
Yeah, and
I think
I
like
had this conversation with our student yesterday, actually. He brought up like volume before intensity or vice versa. And I think I need to go back and clarify after having this conversation with you guys, because what in my head might not be what he's thinking. He might be thinking, going for a 30-minute jog, where I'm talking about doing tempos or plyos or sled work or whatever.
I almost think like the running needs almost be rephrased for especially when you're applying it to kind of the field and court sport athletes, as it's like a locomotion progression. And it's like a locomotion progression should be like slow with high force, increase the speed, decrease the load. So the kind of, force may be kind of staying the same. And then you're decreasing the load and increasing the speed and the not even like necessarily the speed of like the person moving throughout space, but you're increasing like the speed of like the muscle contraction. Because if you're doing like a sled sprint unweighted, they're not going to be achieving a very high velocity, but at least they're starting to get, the ground contact time is decreasing compared to just a heavy sled push, but they're getting a faster muscle contraction. That's something you see with like, that's why when we do, progressions for people coming off of like acute hamstring pulls or calf pulls or whatever, it's like the progression is like a ton of, low level double leg hopping, single leg hopping, skipping, A runs before having them like actually sprint. And I think that makes such a big difference for people to be able to kind of go through that progression of, your muscle contraction velocity is getting really high, but the intensity ends up not being that high because you're not actually going from A to B in a quick period of time. So like your actual velocity that you're achieving is low. And I think that progression is a really like good way to kind of think about like how people should be running, rather than like, oh, we've done a little bit of strength work, we've just done a bunch of stuff in place and you've gotten strong, but then you haven't done anything of actually kind of like moving your body, whether it's forward or backwards or lateral, it doesn't really matter. That's why I think, like you said, Doug, the like sled drag kind of progression and whether, or if it's like HICT or HRI, whatever you want to call it, I don't really care. It's just like, but just doing something like that where you're actually getting the person to apply force on the ground to move their body, even if it's with another object like a sled, is an awesome progression before you're getting them back to running. Because like you said, it is specific strength for like their hip abductors, which, yeah, even if you're coming off an ACL, like because they're not loading the limb, like their hip is going to look funky because they're not used to using the glutes to push in the floor. So a lateral sled drag is a great progression to get somebody back into even just like shuffling and some of those other lateral activities later on.
Yeah, and the progression that we would use for like an ACL isn't much different than what we'd use for like a hamstring strain. Like when someone has a low grade hamstring strain, we're not like, okay, go run a couple of 10-minute miles right now. Like
yeah,
we start with those specific strength type drills, and then we maybe go like tempo and then work up to max velocity and acceleration work. But I don't, for an injured person, like if you're going to, and even like from a swelling standpoint, like if you're going to reintroduce like a higher impact activity like running, why would you do it for a in a high volume fashion initially versus like it's hard to accumulate like a really high volume of foot contacts in some of these drills, or just doing like some tempo work. So even from like a swelling standpoint, like it's much easier to control swelling if you're like, okay, we're going to do like lower volume but relatively higher intensity activity and making sure that it looks good, passes the eye test, there's not a lot of compensation, versus like, okay, we're just going to go run slow and get a lot of foot contacts just to do it because the sheet says it's time to run now. So I just, I think there's ways to prepare for higher volume of running without doing a lot of running, at least initially, until certain benchmarks are met. It just seems like you made a great point. Like running is a plyometric activity, so I don't see how you could do running without having done some plyometrics first. We're not talking about like, depth jumps, jumping off of a barn, but like even jumping on and off to like a 1 or 2 inch box, like that's a plyometric activity. And I would say that like I wouldn't even want to have somebody run or do running drills until they could jump rope first on 2 legs.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, and then I'm thinking about it too, applying these same principles to the upper extremity with like my throwers. I'm always doing plyos, with the rebounder or against the wall or within their hands, passing a weighted ball back and forth. always doing that stuff for like multiple weeks before they're even going to do any sort of low intensity throwing like post-op or anything like that. So it still is, it's the same application, just a different, just a different body part.
I think like the time frame you're talking about too, Doug, with like, like a acute soft tissue injury versus like a post-op case, it's like, yeah, that progression is the exact same of what we do for like a hamstring and an ACL coming back. But the difference is like the ACL person is going to have a lot more time to own A runs, A skips, reverse order, A march, A skip, A run for, maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks before actually starting to do running, versus maybe somebody coming off of an acute injury is progressing within the same week. Maybe the day one on Monday, they're starting with, only A marches, but maybe on Wednesday, they're desensitized and they're feeling better. And we're just doing a lot of A skips and recombinant volume. And then on Friday, they're doing actual A runs for a good amount of volume. And then the next week they could be running. Cause I think that's especially when it comes to like the acute stuff, is it's like, once people stop hurting when they're walking, for athletes, like, oh, you put your hamstring, it hurts when you're walking. Once it stops hurting when they're walking, then they're just jogging, and then they just go to sprinting, and there's no progression of the velocity of the activity to get them back to what they need to be able to do when it comes to the sport itself. And I think that's the same thing we're talking about. Like, you mentioned it before, it's like very few field and course athletes need to be able to do like that super long duration 10-minute mile pace of just kind of, crappy form running, and athletes do accumulate that, but it's either at like almost a walking pace, or it's a more of like a kind of sprint level. And I think there's really not, I don't have a ton of athletes that I really need them to accumulate a ton of that, 10-minute mile a pace jogging volume. I think doing extensive tempo runs and things like that at a 70% pace is much better than just having them go for a 10, 11-minute mile run 3 to 4 times a week, and then increasing the volume of how far they run each time.
Yeah, and there's a ton of research showing that like there are people even a year post-surgery, like when they do a gait analysis, like at mid stance, the surgically repaired side, there's not as much dorsiflexion at the ankle, because to dorsiflex at the ankle, you have to bend the knee, and then people still don't want to load the knee even a year later. And I think a lot of that is because the progression is often run, then do plyometrics. Like when you manipulate a plyometric activity properly, you can force somebody to load the ankle, get some dorsiflexion, and in turn the knee. If you keep, you're going to have a shorter or a longer ground contact time anyway. It's going to be more amortization, more dorsiflexion, more knee flexion. So you can use a plyometric activity to ensure that the knee and the ankle are being loaded before you run. It's much more difficult in a relatively complex activity like running to force certain actions in individual joints, because when you run for the first time without having that low level plyometric base, that's a pretty threatening activity, and you're going to go into defensive mode, especially when you're running on a treadmill, which is a moving surface. It probably creates more anxiety. So doing, a low level plyometric activity, on the turf or on the floor, whatever, where the ground's not moving underneath you, you can force the athlete to achieve foundational positions, whereas it's much harder to do that when you're actually running on a moving surface.
Greg, you had that client, I think it was last year, you had an eval of I think she was a high school, like sophomore or junior, who was like 6 or 7 months post-op ACL, and she was coming to the gym to start training with one of the coaches here, and you evaled her, and it was like, she had been running, I mean, like you can tell the story, but I think she had been running for a couple of weeks or whatever.
I think she just started running like a week or maybe 10 days before I saw her. And yeah, she was about like 11 or 12 weeks post-op ACL, and she hadn't done any sort of skipping. She hadn't done any sort of low-level plyos like this. And she told me, she's like, I really don't like running because I'm really bad at it, and it looks terrible and it feels terrible, but like that's what the doctor's telling me I have to do. So we went over, like we're talking about, we went over a lot of low level things, and the skipping normalized her pattern, and it looked very natural and symmetrical. So I was like, all right, then instead of running for now, like just skip. If you're going to be told that you need to go do 10 minutes of cardio or whatever, like skip a little bit and then like walk a little bit and then do some plyos, and like kind of just gave her a bunch of random things to do. Cause eventually like I wasn't going to continue working with this person anyway. So I don't really have too much say in like what she's going to wind up doing, so to speak. But yeah, it was kind of disappointing, and she wasn't happy with it either. So they can tell, if you're just going to go right back to running, it's not going to be not going to feel good. It's not going to look good, and I don't think the athlete's going to be very confident and happy with how they're running if they don't do the things we're talking about beforehand.
I think that's a really good point, that you can use these drills and use the same like set rep time schemes that you would use with running early on. Like, let's say, someone is even 2 months post-op and they can do like step overs to the ankle. I mean, a typical like extensive tempo protocol might be like, okay, we'll start out with, 15 seconds on, 45 seconds off, and we'll do, 2 series of 8 reps. And over the course of a couple of weeks, we'll work up to doing, 4 series of 8 reps, whatever. Like, you can do that with an ankle step over when they're not ready to run. Just meet them where they're at. Like, if they have the strength and range of motion to achieve a certain progression in the drill, you can accumulate volume in that drill. So now they're still getting a, like an aerobic benefit. They're getting a systemic benefit, accumulating volume, which I think is good just from an overall desensitization standpoint. And then when they're ready for the next part of the progression, you can restart the set and rep scheme, like kind of like just regular periodization. Like, now go back to, if you were doing, let's say, 4 sets of 8, 15-second ankle step overs. Now you can do it, we're going to knee level and then to hip level. And it's going to be very dynamic because it's rehab. You don't need to do like 4-week progressions, but you're developing energy systems that are more, relevant to sport versus just like not doing any of that type of work. And then going from just like purely like aerobic work to now we're going to do more pure aerobic work in the form of long, slow running. And you're never doing anything that's a little bit more explosive and matches the demands of the game. So you can take these drills and use whatever protocols you want and accumulate volume that way. So we're not volume averse, but it's like, let's get volume in the right activities, and let's get volume that's even more specific from like the demands of a game standpoint than just doing more of stuff just because the protocol says to do it.
I think that point of what you just said there, of getting volume in the right activities, is like almost like that should be like the take home message for this thing. Cause it is like, people have to get back to running. I think people get back to running too soon without accumulating, like you said, the appropriate stresses prior to running, which is like we've been talking about this whole time, those plyometric activities, low intensity, very elastic event, gradually decreasing the ground contact times of whatever kind of locomotion activity that you're doing, whether it is, sled stuff, whether it's hopping stuff, plyometrics, whether it's shuffling, whether it's, actual linear running or backpedaling, doesn't really matter. It's just accumulating the appropriate type of stress systematically to get back to, higher levels of intensity and higher velocities. Because that's what ultimately these field and court sport athletes have to be able to do, is they have to be able to go really fast, stop, recover in a short amount of time, and repeat those efforts. So if we're just only accumulating, slow velocities and ton of volume with that, when we're never really touching those explosive activities, like you mentioned, Doug, it's like then the athlete is definitely going to be ill prepared once they get back on the field.
And that's like we've spoken about before, like this is all a skill. Like, running is a skill, sprinting is a skill that we're trying to quote unquote optimize or improve, or whatever you want to call it, whether it's the speed or the technique of it. So this is all just how are you going to build a skill? You just have to do something as close as possible to that skill that you can within the constraints of a rehab protocol or injury or whatever it is, tissue healing properties or whatever. But then I had something else I just thought of that I forgot already. I keep doing this. Anyway,
that's the hard part when you have like 3 of us all talking at the same time.
I know.
Well, I think that what you're saying made me think that there's the controversy over like whether there's a quote unquote like good way to run. The reality is, in like a post-op scenario, it doesn't matter, because like 2 months post-op, people aren't going to be running anyway. So the whole idea with like, well, how somebody naturally runs and self-organizes, that's always the best thing. Because people can't run right after a surgery, we can actually take more of like a technical approach to running, where we use like these different drill progressions, because that's all they can do anyway, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's going to be the closest thing to running, even if they run in a way that might not adhere to like what we think of as a good technical model in running. It's the closest activity that's going to mimic how they run, regardless. So if we're doing like the mock drills as an example, that's all they can do. So now we're doing these mock drills, and now when we think they're actually ready to run, even if they go back to their quote unquote old way of running, I still think that using these drill progressions better prepares them for their old way of running than just doing like slower running. But where the
Yeah.
opportunity lies is now if someone's never actually been coached in running, now because we've constantly reinforced, okay, vertical, at least at top speed, not acceleration, these drills constantly reinforce vertical posture, vertical foot strike, front side mechanics. Now that they've had, probably 6 weeks of context with doing these drills. So now when we put them on a treadmill for the first time and have them do some more tempo type work, their body is going to be much more receptive to, if we do want to cue them to run a certain way, we're not starting from ground zero. They have context from doing the drill. So we can say, look, like, since it's your first time running in whatever, however many months, like when you run, focus on a vertical foot strike, focus on not straightening your knees and overstriding when you run, whatever cues you want to use. It's their first time running in however long. So it's an opportunity to utilize a technical model and without having to, because when people are like, quote unquote, healthy, they're like, well, I can run at a high output my normal way. So why would I want to like take a step back and run slower or relearn this new activity? They're effectively relearning how to run regardless. So you may as well have some kind of a technical model to start from. You could always deviate from it, but I think in a post-op scenario, like they're not going to be able to run the way they want to run anyway. So it's a unique opportunity to teach running as a skill because you're going to be limited as far as your timeline goes. They're only going to be able to progress so rapidly anyway. So it's more conducive to teaching a technical model. Whereas when somebody's healthy, they might not have the patience for it.
Yeah, and like you said, the sled then builds the context for any of the acceleration postures and positions and angles that we're looking for too. So that's perfect. I did remember what I wanted to say. Trevor, I've seen you use either for yourself or a couple of your athletes, you've done like a 20-yard cone to cone, like tempo run type thing where they're actually then mixing in change of directions. How do you see that kind of fitting into the progression here?
I mean, I think that's part of, I think it's the same, and that can be a kind of another conversation that I think you and I did a podcast for on, Greg, like the difference between like change of direction and agility and the reactive components and whatever. But I think when you're doing like a tempo run, and like I'll do like basically like a 5-10-5 setup, but instead of 5-10-5, it'll be 10-20-10, just to increase the distance. So they're going like a total of 40 yards. And I like that because like I'm not trying to have them go as fast as they possibly can, and they're having to redirect the momentum at a lower velocity, which makes the task a little bit easier, but it starts getting them to find change of direction angles. And you're working on, rather than the kind of like just upright, you're getting in a few different acceleration positions. You're getting them to work on some of the different change of direction skills, like a rotational stop and things like that. So I think to me, that's a part of the, it's like the same thing as an extensive tempo. If you're doing like 100-yard extensive tempo or whatever distance you kind of choose, I think it's part of that progression of accumulating a lower intensity volume at a distance that you're going to get an aerobic benefit with, but it's going to keep the intensity of activity relatively low, while also building in some different movement skills that the athlete is going to have to eventually be able to do.
Yeah, I like that.
Awesome.
Cool. I think we beat that up enough. Anything else before we go?
I think that's it.
That's good. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Resilient Performance Podcast. As a thank you for listening, we'd like to offer a 10% discount on our online products, which you can find at resilientperformance.com. We'd like you to use the promo code PODCAST, PODCAST, to get the 10% off. Right now we have the Resilient Movement Foundations course online format for you to purchase there. And we hope to grow that soon before the end of the year and have some other offerings. We hope you enjoy. Again, that's promo code PODCAST, PODCAST, for 10% off. Thanks.